first event of the morning here in ICC Hall 6, this Conservative Home discussion in conversation with Ben Wallace. I'm Mark Wallace, the Chief Executive of Conservative Home. Thank you to all of you, we've got a packed room here, who've turned up this morning, and all of you watching at home on the Conservative Home YouTube channel as well. It's a little known fact that the Conservative Party has a policy a little bit like the royal family when it comes to Wallaces, in that it won't actually let us travel together in case in dire circumstances it happens to mislay both of us. So you're very lucky to get us here both in the same room, the Conservative Party's premier collection of Wallaces. I don't need to introduce Ben Wallace, because you all are here precisely because you know who he is. You've seen the pivotal work that he's been doing. You, like me, I'm sure, are keen to hear much more from him this morning on a wide variety of the challenges that he and his team have been grappling with, that they continue to face, and their plans for the future. I suppose, if it's all right, Dan, let's start off with a question. Robert Conquest, the historian, originally wrote his book on the Stalinist terror, and was widely rubbished and disbelieved by kind of Kremlin apologists during the Cold War for its claims. And after the KGB files were opened, his publisher suggested an update, and he wrote an extra chapter on what it revealed. And they asked him for a subtitle for the new edition. And he suggested, pardon my French, "I told you so, you fucking fools." Which they didn't go with, but I think would have been a valid, apologies to my mum, who's probably watching online, but probably would have been a valid claim. When you think back to, for example, Barack Obama rubbishing Mitt Romney, you know, the 1980s called it, wants its foreign policy back, he said in a debate when Romney said that Russia was the major international threat to the international order. When you think back, dare I say, even to some of the coalition days when Russia at times was not mentioned in major strategic policy reviews, do you get a feeling like Robert Conquest?
No, I mean, I think, unlike Robert Conquest, I've been fortunate as security minister for 3 and a bit years to have witnessed what most public don't see. You know, I saw what the Russians do around the world. I used to see, obviously, in intelligence reports, their activities. I witnessed firsthand the Skripal issue. I was the security minister when that happened. So I have unlike him, who had to wait effectively for the archives to be opened, I could see it. But I think, if I think all the way back, I remember being based in Germany and the Russians were still in Magdeburg, so the wall had come down, but the Russian army was, again, depleted, hollowed out, and predominantly broke, and they used to come and sell kit second-hand to just raise money, and some of my soldiers would be very good at buying all sorts of stuff. I remember having in my cupboard, I think, a Soviet Arctic warfare kit. I don't know why. I think the Moths got it in the end. But, you know, so I remember a sort of depleted, to some extent, you know, humiliated Russian or Soviet structure system that hasn't, to this day, reconciled itself with why, and in fact likes to attack the West for its failures rather than recognise that its politicians are culpable for the conditions and the life that their population have. It's still wrapped in that historical sort of warped view about suffering is what qualifies you to be the best Russian, not outcomes. And, you know, I think I met Shoigu in Moscow in February, the week before the invasion, or 10 days, and I said to him, look, you know, you will just get a lot more sanctions. And he said, it doesn't matter, we can suffer like no one else. And I just said, well, I don't want people to suffer, and even in Russia. And they didn't sort of... So I think, I don't think it's a matter of told you so, but I think the signs have been there for a very, very long time. And we should have all recognised how they've behaved on the international platforms. And, you know, how a country behaves is not just about how its leader behaves, it's also how its population behaves. And any of us who've had time bumping into, and I haven't actually, I spent most of my life avoiding oligarchs, because most of the oligarchs I ever came across never made their money by inventing anything. They seemed to rob their own state, was how they basically made a lot of their wealth. And I think, you know, people like Bill Bowder spotted it quite early on when he worked in Moscow. If you remember, he's done that whole book about Putin's sort of regime. The signs were there, but I think maybe people didn't want to listen.
And with that point on this question of what part wider, say, Russian culture or Russian political culture, perhaps I should say Muscovite political culture, given that there seems to be quite a distinct difference of policy, particularly in terms of, say, military conscription within Russia between its heartlands and its outlying ethnic minority regions. Do you feel like it's fully appreciated in the capitals of the West and in the media of the West, the degree to which this isn't perhaps simply a war that Vladimir Putin has personally forced on all of Russia and its institutions without any willingness? And actually, there certainly was in the early stages of this war when it seemed like another opportunity for Russia to self-aggrandize, potentially to pillage, and to give a bloody nose to its enemies. There was a groundswell of support in various parts of Russian society for this war, and is that something that can't?
Well, I mean, the opinion polls still show significant support. I sometimes wonder when you do your league table whether you're using the same Putin pollster as the one that produced it. You know, I feel very lucky to have a approval rating of 85.8%, but it's getting up there in the sort of Russian levels of believability. To be honest, I mean, it's very kind to be topped, but it's still a strong polling. However, given that you can get, I think, 15 years in prison for disagreeing with the war, I suspect if that pollster rings you from, downtown Moscow and says, "Do you support the war?" you'll get to probably be very quick to say yes. I think what it also shows is Russia's not very joined up. I mean, he controls nearly all the media, so the ability for the public to connect what's happening in their village with the next village and the other town and get a sense of the cumulative loss of Russia is much harder than it would be in our system. The social media would be quicker than the mainstream media to point out there are thousands of dead bodies in everyone's graveyards. So it hasn't really changed. I think the population are now coalescing behind the sort of, well, we've got a strong leader and everyone's against us, and but you can't hide it in the long run. And the scale of deaths that is now coming back to the Russians will eventually take their toll, but at the moment, I don't see any light at the end of this tunnel.
And related to that, when we see the escalation and intensification of the sheer chauvinist, hyper-nationalist aggression of the political culture around Vladimir Putin, when we saw things like the rally, the staged rally the other day for the bogus annexation of various occupied, and in some cases, I think they were annexing places that Ukraine's in the process of taking back from them. At that rally, what does that tell you about the prospects of the end game of this conflict? How do you feel when you hear people, as we've seen at times over the last few months, it was very important to give Vladimir Putin an off-ramp to save face? Is there, when you see rallies like that, effectively openly totalitarian fascist parades, does that leave regime change as the only option, effectively, in Russia?
No, I mean, we're not in the business of regime change, okay, and no one in the West is. It's for the Russian people to decide their government and to do what they have to do for whatever they wish. I mean, I think there are two things that are sort of surprising. First of all, the off-ramp. I mean, I've heard that lots of times. Every time you think there is a possibility for President Putin to take some form of off-ramp, he does the complete opposite, and he pushes himself. He builds his own cage around himself. It's quite extraordinary that, he could have, earlier on declared some sort of partial victory and just consolidated on a small amount of ground and said, "Look, I've won it," and reinforced it and made everyone ask the question and made the Ukrainians ask, "Do you really want to go to the next step?" Didn't do that. He could make a big play about some form of negotiations. He's never done that, and then his troops commit atrocities, and it's. Or he, everyone goes to Unger, and then he makes this odd speech. He threatens nuclear, whatever it was. So you couldn't sort of make it up. I mean, he absolutely. I mean, I think even if you built him a gold off ramp tomorrow morning, he would deliberately crash into it or do the opposite.
Steal it.
Yeah, I mean, probably is gold. But I mean, I think in that sense, that's very difficult. That you cannot see this ending any other way than Russia continually to try and do what it does in the hope that its brutality will be the battle-winning component. And that's why it's so important we don't let him win. Because his military tactics are not the battle-winning component. his equipment has been demonstrated to not be the winning component. What we call the sort of moral component he doesn't have, which is what the Ukrainians have. So he's left with two battle-winning calculations he might try and make, which is, if I'm more brutal than anyone else, and I don't respect any Geneva Conventions or anything else, then I win. And if I'm the biggest bully on the block with threatening nuclear this and that, then I win. If those two threats or actions are allowed to win, what will it mean for the world? You know, every adversary and bad guy across the world will be watching, and if they see that brutality is the battle-winning component, that is how they'll progress, whether that's in Africa, whether that's in Asia. So we cannot let that be victorious in what his componency is. So I don't think he's going to take an off-ramp. And I also think the West, go back to your total stuff, the problem was there was a large part of all our system who comforted themselves that he was deeply rational and that this was all about NATO. And that's why I got so angry in January. I wrote this article saying that NATO is absolutely the straw man, right? You know, even in his rant on Friday, Putin only mentions NATO in passing. In his 19-page essay, he mentions it on one paragraph, right? Because what he really is an ethnic nationalist living out a fantasy of unifying a so-called ancient people, raving against Anglo-Saxons, even though quite a number of those ancient people, if he actually knows his history, who come down from Finland, will have a Viking, Saxon sort of pedigree. Ranting, that's what it's about. It's not about NATO. I mean, Finland and Sweden has joined NATO, but I haven't seen him invading there. I mean, you know, he hasn't got anything to invade with, but I think what we see in politics and government over the years is people construct a comfortable argument that they all like to live in, even though it's artificial, to make themselves feel comfortable. Well, you know, I remember the Foreign Office advised me last year that I shouldn't go to the 30th anniversary of the founding of independent Ukraine because it might provoke Putin. I mean, what a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, Putin was never going to be provoked by me going on a visit to Ukraine. And you don't need to ask me, you need to ask Putin, because he writes that in his essays about what he actually thinks about the people of Ukraine. But it's, you know, everyone thinks that, and that's how bullies win, in my view. So, you know, sadly, pitting and Kabul happened, so I wasn't going to go anyhow, but it was a sort of, you know, it just makes people comfortable that they can construct these bogus sort of arguments.
And how late on in this process, maybe it's still happening now, I don't know, were you hearing arguments like that within, say, British government or within Whitehall?
And there's still people who talk about NATO expansion. I mean, you know, my friend Michael Gove was asked, should Ukraine join NATO? And he said no, right? Well, NATO policy is not for him to decide. It's an open-door policy. Any state can apply to join NATO as long as it signs up to the values of, you know, human rights and international law, etc. And then it's a matter for all 30 of us to decide if a country should join NATO. Of course, a country in conflict doesn't join NATO. Of course, a country with unresolved issues around, you know, rule of law, etc., doesn't. But if in how many years Ukraine applies to join NATO, if they're successful and victorious, you know, we should look at it on its merits. It already is on the process, by the way. It is already on a path. It is a associate member, or whatever they call it, I think, which is the one step before member accession plan. But there are people who are saying, and obviously Michael, no, you know, it's just about this will provoke Putin. Well, when I last looked, Putin provoked himself. I mean, you can't provoke him any more than what he's doing, right? I mean, how much he's invaded a country and murdered thousands of people. I mean, you know, what's he going to do next? Invade a country and kill thousands of people? Well, he's already done that.
What do you think the root of that? Because that is something we've heard at times in various parts of the right over the last decade. For example, as a Eurosceptic, it frustrates or annoys me when I sometimes come across people who hate the EU so much it sounds like they're willing to like the Kremlin as a result. Where do you think? I think, you know, the history of some of these fallacies in left-wing politics has been quite well charted and quite well scrutinised, certainly during, say, the Corbyn years. Where do you think this kind of idea comes from in the centre-right?
I don't think it's... No, to be fair, look, Michael's taking a view, I disagree with it, but he's taken a view that clearly NATO should not expand into Ukraine, and, you know, I mean, he'd have to explain why he thinks that would be, if he thinks it's provocative or he just thinks it's the wrong thing. That, you know, he might say that Ukraine is not a European country or whatever he has a theory about. I don't know, but it's best to ask him. But I don't think it's on the centre right. I think it's on the far right, which is this adoration of extreme nationalism means that all other sins can be forgiven. You know, well, he's a nationalist. You know, Putin's proud of Russia, and we're proud of whatever country we want to run, and therefore, you know, we don't like the rules of anything. We don't like international law and order. We don't like rules. So it's a funny, I know what you mean, it's a funny relationship between people that would say they're authoritarian, but then not want to follow any form of really international rule of law, structure, or regard for human rights. I've always thought that's a funny thing of the far right. It doesn't quite add up. Of course, Putin is not beyond funding those groups. You know, we've seen a number of far-right groups across the West funded by Putin, or indeed by people on his behalf. In the United States, there was definitely suggestion that in the sort of Black Lives Matter campaign, the two extremist groups, the very far right in the United States and the very far left in the Black Lives Matter, were both receiving or getting some form of magnification of their message on the internet by the Russian state. So they weren't getting funding or anything, so I'm not claiming that, but you know, when their messages would go out on social media, they somehow got an amazing boost from certain people, probably in the Trolls factory in St. Petersburg, because he was interested in magnifying division. And I think he feels breaking international security sort of partnerships strengthens Russia. And I think it's an interesting difference between Russia and China, which is, it seems to me that the Russian state of mind in their leadership is, we don't have to improve ourselves, we just have to weaken our competition, and by default we'll therefore get stronger. So
leveling down.
Yes, exactly right. I mean, the fact we haven't fixed whether people have inside lavatories or running water or electricity or broadband or better, you know, better health services is irrelevant, because what I've done is I've made them feel better because I've weakened the person over there. So I think that's a very interesting psyche, but it seems to be the only thing that matters to them, rather than actually improving their own people's existence a lot.
And this is, in some ways, this has quite a long-standing Russian policy. If I recall correctly, during the Cold War, various senior figures in the neo-Nazi movements in West Germany, for example, would prove since to be direct agents of the KGB or of the Stasi, among others. This kind of destabilization strategy. But then we also see Vladimir Putin, of course, working extremely hard to try to cast Ukraine as being a Nazi state.
Yeah, I mean, look, a lot of it's about nationalism in its purest form. You know, he uses the biker gangs. You know, those massive biker gangs that I think if one of those former Eastern Bloc countries seeks to take down a Stalinist statue or something, this 700-person biker gang turns up to demonstrate, and pretty intimidating group of ex-veterans. I just think it goes to that heart, and it's always been in the Tory party, we are patriotic, but you know, what is the definition of nationalism to the extent that it overrules everything and becomes a far-right discussion or a far-right policy, and it doesn't always follow logical paths. You know, there are lots of nationalists who are in fact left-wing insofar as they're big state people, very big state. They want a big state. You know, the National Aryan Socialist Party. You know, the Third Reich was very much a big state. It wasn't a small state government, but you know, it wraps itself in the flag and then it gets put into the right. But actually, on its economics and its construct of big state, you know, you would say that it's on its left, and actually the removal of choice that we all think is deeply part of being on the centre right, the freedoms of choice, our choice, is the very things that suffer in an extreme right nationalist groups. They don't like people to have a different view or opinion or choice. So it's I just think, you know, I mean, the mapping of the far right in all our politics is something that's probably worth looking at, and I know there are lots of books on it, but it's never something that we should have anything to do with, because we believe in individual freedom.
While we're on that topic, how concerned are you about, we've seen some of this in the United States, for example, on the efforts of far-right groups to recruit people within the military or within the wider veteran community?
Well, when I was security minister, we uncovered a number of, we arrested a few people who were both, there were very few, but there was a plot, I think it was National Action, which was the prescribed far-right terrorist organisation, had recruited one or two people in the military, and the others were civilians, and I think that ring was broken up and people either convicted or discharged. I think they try, but they don't get much success in this country. We've seen it in other countries. But, I mean, luckily, Britain's relationship with the far right is not a success story for the far right. And, I'm a Lancashire MP. We've had in our past BNP county councillors in Lancashire, or councillors, and they usually don't last very long.
Going back to those, can you give the audience some insight into those early days of the run-up to Russia's re-invasion or further invasion of Ukraine and the immediate aftermath of it? You said you were getting foreign office advice last summer to not go to Ukraine. How much of an internal battle did you have to fight within government, within Whitehall, to ensure that Britain ended up in the right place in terms of supporting the Ukrainians?
It was more of an institutional sort of lethargy than it was. Well, in some cases there was some outright opposition, which is fine, and that's why we have these forums. And I was very lucky. I was supported by Boris Johnson right from the beginning, and we could make the case. When you've got a Prime Minister who supports the Defence Secretary, that's a powerful thing, and he absolutely, right from the start. I mean, you have to go right back to the post-2014. Britain started training with Canada, Sweden, the United States, and I think Estonia, Ukrainian armed forces. Op Orbital is our name. We'd done about, I think, 40,000 of them, training them, and we were on the programme of defence reform and trying to help them in their defence reform, partly as preparation for their application to NATO, but also because it was in our, what we saw happened in Crimea was unacceptable, and that helping them defend themselves was absolutely key to making sure that Russia hopefully wouldn't come back again. So that we were there from the beginning. But if you remember, last April was the key moment. I think it was April. There was a massive Russian exercise, huge. And they massed huge numbers of forces on the borders off Ukraine and did huge amounts of exercises in Crimea and everything else. And there was a slight split. The United States and Britain felt this was very much a prelude to something. They were doing things they wouldn't normally do. Some of the weapon systems they were deploying were not what you would do in a normal training exercise. And then, but a lot of other countries were like, no, it's just an exercise. They're just trying to intimidate and remind people that they could if they wanted to, but they're not going to. And then, of course, this is where they are clever, and it's why some of my defence reforms are determined to improve the readiness of our armed forces, is they then left behind a lot of their equipment. So they sent the troops home, but they left their armoured vehicles and everything else not far from the border. So the speed that they could then deploy them really hinged on how long it would take you to get your troops on a train, start the engines, reissue ammunition stocks and logistics like blood supplies and everything else, and then you can ready to go. And if you can cut that down from a 2-month period to a couple of weeks, you can really start picking a moment. And so we were very concerned way back in April when we started to say this. Some of us we were seeing what we could obviously see on open source and other sources, what was going on. But people didn't really want to believe. I mean, to be fair, if you're rational, why would you do what he's done? Right? I mean, a lot of countries, even when presented with some evidence, would say, yeah, but that would be irrational. Why would he? Why would he invade Ukraine and destroy his international standing and suffer huge sanctions? It's illogical. And, you can imagine, imagine countries like Germany that are very logical would say, look, he's rational. And to be fair, we're all trained to look at intelligence in a rational way, and we all engage in a rational process of when, the Chilcot reforms and all those things, intelligence comes in, you look at it, you don't jump to, pure gut feelings, and you don't, the electorate deserve to know that their politicians are following a proper process, which is post the 45-minute claim is why they did it. So people just couldn't understand why he would do something so irrational. And actually, you know, I can't. I mean, why would he do what he's done? I mean, he's lost in the long run. I mean, he has lost, no matter what happens, he's lost in the long run. And so people would understandably say it's not logical, it's not rational, and therefore he's not going to do it.
Obviously, Britain is currently training, I think, 10, 12,000 Ukrainian troops at a time within the UK, as well as our continued support in Ukraine. Ukraine probably now has the most battle-tested army in the world. Do you foresee there's going to be a time when the Ukrainian army will be training British troops?
Well, they already are, in a sense. I mean, I go and regularly visit where they are trained here, not only to see them, but to listen to their stories. I met a platoon commander who'd taken out a Russian tank with an N-law. You learn the lessons of what they're learning on the battlefield. So, for example, the cheap little drones that are dropping hand grenades mean that, you know, in our old system, we all have this sort of terribly British worked out, you know, you're injured on the front line, you've got X hours to get back to the company aid post, you've got 15 hours, whatever it is, to get to the Roll 2 hospital. It was all very nice. Of course, along comes a little crappy drone dropping a grenade on you, and you need a hardened vehicle to get out of there. Otherwise, you have to treat them where they fall. So suddenly they're doing a lot more treatment where they fall, which means they need more tourniquets than we would normally deliver, because we're like, you're in and you're out. So even the most basic thing, you know, the Ukrainians don't touch their radios when they're in training, because they are so conditioned about controlling their electronic signal, because the Russians will spot that and then put artillery on. Their discipline is unbelievable compared to ours, you know. And so we're learning how long-range artillery is changing the battlefield, how artillery coupled with, you know, those little drones can make artillery incredibly accurate and deliver far fewer rounds on target necessary than the hundreds you might do, or 50-odd you might do. And you know, I think about my time serving. We had a human being called a forward observation officer. I think they call them JSOCs or JOC, what they've got a term now. And they were the forward observation officer, and their job was to go as far forward with the infantry to spot the artillery targets and correct the artillery and do it that way. Well, you still have those people, but now you've got someone 5 kilometres ahead, and it's called a little drone, and it spots a little tank, and if you can deliver longer range artillery, which they now have right onto a tank, suddenly, or a headquarters, you're using very little rounds to achieve the same effect. So the thing we're learning the most, not just from them, but seeing it, is the future war is about hiding and finding. If you can be found on a current battlefield in Ukraine, Ukrainians' only challenge is, do they have enough ammunition to kill you, right? And what is the priority target? And if you want to hide, you better be quick, you've got to better use electronic warfare, and you better do things differently. Now, if I look across all our militaries in Europe, we spend a lot of money in finding ISR, everything from overhead to, you know, cyber to traditional electronic warfare. Not enough, by the way, but we spend a lot on it. I wonder if you flip that and ask how much we spend on hiding ourselves, you'll find it completely out of kilter. So hiding and finding is going to be the future, because ranges have changed. The ability for even, you know, Mrs. Miggins with her iPhone to watch your tank and report it to the centre. You know, there's a story in Ukraine where I think, you know, a babushka, an old sort of granny, spotted some Russian tanks, phoned it in, and then they were flattened by artillery.
They have an app and a phone line, don't they? That you can
I sometimes retweet the SBU app for people, you know, can report sites, the Russians. So suddenly, you know, and in war, your accuracy is not, you know, you are going to do your best to be accurate, but you might not collaborate as many sources of target. You're going to get on with it. That changes things. So you better be able to hide, and it's about finding. So we're learning that. And the other thing is, we've got Finns teaching, we've got Danes, we've got Swedes. We've put them all in the same camp, so the Vikings are all in one place. We've got Lithuanians, we've got Canadians, we've got New Zealanders, we've got Dutch, and fun enough, we're learning from them. So the one thing the Finns are fantastic at is fighting in forests. And when we talk about forests in Britain, we talk about forestry blocks and the Brecon Beacons, which if you've ever had the discomfort of spending a night in, is pretty grim. Their forests are hundreds of kilometres, right? So how you fight hundreds of kilometres when 2/3 of your country is a forest is an entirely different military proposition to how we were trained to fight in our forestry and forestry blocks. So actually watching the Finns teach the Ukrainians, and we sent a squadron of tanks recently to Finland, we're learning a lot. And the trick in our armed forces is to learn and how quickly does that doctrine change and who's in charge of it? Where's the thought leadership is the question I often ask.
I will go to the audience very shortly because I know there'll be a lot of questions for you in the room, Ben. I asked my Twitter followers this morning if they had any questions for you, and I'm going to say
That's a really bad question.
Yeah, I asked them to DM them rather than say them in public, but you can never account for these things. I've got to say, almost every single one of them asked some variation of, does he regret not standing for the leadership?
So it's 9:45 on our second day in the conference.
We've got half an hour to go on this
topic. What do you think?
Well,
Would you like to be the Prime Minister this morning?
You mentioned the league table.
I've been pretty... I saw the Telegraph articles, they're a bit odd. Look, the reality is, it wasn't for me, right? If you want to be Prime Minister, you have to really, really want it to the extent that nothing else matters. And that doesn't matter whether you're a Labour politician or whatever. And I didn't want it that much. I love the job I do. If I could pick the right winner, I would hopefully stay in the job. Anything's possible in the Tory party these days. So, I could finish what I started. And I am privileged that I have done every rank in government, and experience matters.
Almost every rank in government.
Not doing that one. It is, we are always quick to jump on the shiny new colleague, right? Everyone falls in love with, the high speed, the youngest chancellor or the youngest.
If you're naming a name, you can.
No, but we've done it forever, right? Tony Blair, Rishi Sunak, or young people, come out for it. Everyone loves it, but actually, learning your trade matters in governing hugely complex departments. The lazy shorthand is all the civil service. It's not always the civil service. It's mostly about how ministers see through their initiatives and deliver them to the fingertips. I don't really have much of a life outside defence because if I want to reform that department, a big old oil tanker that doesn't like change, and I can tell you as an ex-soldier myself, the most conservative organisation in the whole of government is probably the army. It's not the police force. It's not. The army is. It takes a lot to change those systems. You have to see it through to the end. And any ministerial job, if you get reshuffled within 2 years, you'll get to achieve very little, right? Because the system will wait you out, or it just takes time. So you get to 3 years plus, where I am, you can start to affect change. You start to outlive your directors and your DGs. You start to appoint and shape the department. And I'd like to do that. And I like passionately that when I leave politics to know that we have started reversing the managed decline of defence that we've seen for 40 years, where we have seen a constant peace dividend taken out of it, where, and I said it yesterday, but the Treasury went from taking a peace dividend that was perfectly acceptable in 1991 to a corporate radar. We are losing the deep culture in our organisation about facing annual or basically cuts that never do anything other than stand still at the best, is a really depressing part of our defence that we need to change. And it's really interesting. Liz has made some really clear pledges on defence, 3% of GDP by 2030, 2.5% by 2026. Very clear pledge. My own organisation doesn't want to believe it. The Treasury definitely doesn't want to believe it, right? Because that's 40 years or 30 odd years of change.
Obviously, we've seen.
So the point is, I feel fulfilled. I love to finish what I do. I didn't want it that much.
Thank you. Obviously, we've seen. Last one from me, I promise. Obviously, this morning we've seen a U-turn from the Treasury, from the government on 45p. Those pledges, you just mentioned the importance of them in the department and to you, and you mentioned them when you announced where your vote was going in the leadership. Are you concerned that if the government might get into the habit of turning, and if it does, that the pledges made to you might be victim to that?
Well, first of all, the 45% was not part of anybody's leadership pledge, right? So this was not a commitment that a candidate made to you, the membership. There were a number of pledges made by all the candidates, and all of us as MPs and members will expect those candidates to stick to those pledges, subject to, you know, catastrophe or whatever. But fundamentally, on the defence spending thing, it doesn't require an immediate rise. It's by 2030, by 26. For defence spending to meet those targets, it will start to have to go up roughly in 2024. Right? So I have an envelope that takes me to, I think, end of next year. So we'll be in our negotiations next year for our settlement period, but it doesn't start to go up till then anyhow. So there is time. There are, you know, a couple of years of actually, you know, the challenges Liz has to basically get the country back on track and back to work, etc., and etc. is really important. So, you know, I'm confident. You know, I saw her last week, and she said to me, "No, I mean it, right?" I mean, she gets the same as I do, the sense of institutional resistance. You know, she gets it's just a mindset that the government has for decades got into of, well, you know, it's defence, everyone loves defence, but they're not really going to fund it. And, you know, I said in my speech yesterday that, you know, Prime Ministers wanted more and Chancellors wanted less, and that was forever thus. And they do it in a very crude way. So headcount in our armed forces is bonkers, the way they do it. You know, the fundamental way you should say, if you want to make, you know, find savings in departments on headcount, don't do headcount, do salary envelope. You know, in your total wage bill, can you reduce your total wage bill? I mean, the idea that the Treasury sits around there and says, what we need is 54, you know, we need 1,500 less soldiers. What? I mean, what do they know about the soldiers of the army? What they should be saying is, can you reduce your wage bill by 10%? Now, or 20%, or no percent, whatever it is. That's the way you'd run a business. I mean, you wouldn't, you know, if you ran a business, the first question you'd ask yourself is, can I get more for less, or can I take out a band of management? Can I reduce X or Y? You know, why don't we give the army the challenge of, you know, here's a wage package. Can you reorganise yourself to get more infanteers and less whatever, or the other way around? You know, can you actually do it? I mean, I do sort of reflect that the army structure I see today is the same one I served in 91. Hasn't moved an inch. Hasn't like, you know, platoons are still 24 to 28 people. I can tell you off the top of my head the size of all these things. And that doesn't quite. That's different in the other two services. So look, Liz has been very clear. I supported her not just because of the pledges, because I thought Liz is actually, you know, at the heart of Liz's narrative is she wants and needs wealth creation to grow this country. It's that simple. We do not get ourselves out of where we are as an economy unless we help create wealth. Right? That's it. And it's not about tax, it's about tax receipts. If we want what we want, we need to grow our tax receipts. Right? And you can do it two ways. You can tax your way through that, but that won't stimulate real growth. Real wealth creation happens when you stimulate growth. And that is ultimately what we're trying to do. You know, grow the wealth of this, you know, wealth creators. And let's not forget the top 10% pay what? What percentage of the tax?
29, 30 income tax?
Yeah, and the top 50% pay nearly all, 70-odd% of all tax, right? So the wealth creating part of this economy, small businesses, some big businesses, financial services, you know, manufacturing, aerospace parts, they need innovators, the service sector, they need to create wealth, because that's how they're going to fund the other half of society, the public sector, so we can fund the NHS. I mean, you can't do the old tired labour excuse, which is you keep recycling the same pounds through the same public sector work. It goes round and round in a circle. That doesn't actually create wealth. I mean, you've got to grow, convert stuff into wealth and create wealth, both by competing internationally. And so that is at the heart of Liz's campaign and her ambition. And you know, coupled by that is a determination to improve productivity, because one of the ways our country is not as productive as it should be. And I haven't really seen any real productivity reforms in this country since Margaret Thatcher.
So I did promise we'd come to the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Conservative Homes. There are a couple of house rules, as you would expect. When I ask you to put your question, please wait for my colleague to reach you with a microphone. Please say who you are and where you're from. And a question is a question. And if it turns out to be a speech, I will boo you until you sit down. And I'm sure the rest of the audience will probably join me as well. So let's start with a question here.
Hello, Graham Hutton. I'm chair of Newcastle under Lyme Conservative Association. The Russians have had some spectacular misses, missiles hitting their own cities, missing islands by 30-odd miles. What's the chance of them hitting Poland, and what are the consequences when they attack a NATO country?
Well, look, on the latter question, we are deliberately ambiguous about scenarios, but fundamentally, Article 5 of NATO is very clear. An attack on one is an attack on all, and that is solid and in concrete and will be stood by. Now, Article 5 does not necessarily mean total war. I mean, I think people sometimes think it means the whole thing, but nevertheless, there will be a response to attacks on NATO. That is a fact. Yes, Russia have some pretty dodgy equipment that doesn't seem to be working very well. But then when you're a regime that doesn't seem to care about the impact on civilians, to them, what do they care? Or indeed a regime that just lies anyhow when it goes wrong. So I think there is a possibility, but a very small possibility. I mean, Poland is a long way from where the battle is. I mean, it's vast. It's the size of Germany and France put together, Ukraine. It is absolutely vast. I was there last Wednesday, I think, and you wouldn't know. You wouldn't have known there was a war on all the way to Kyiv, where I drove. And you just wouldn't know the farmers in the fields. It's huge. So I think it is at the moment, highly unlikely, but possible.
Let's try and take two questions in one go. A question here, and then a question there, please.
Hi, my name's Michael Cann. I'm a councillor in Winchester, but I'm also a very proud Army reservist. Going through Army Officer Selection Board and Sandhurst this last 12 months has been one of the greatest experiences of my life. When it comes to recruitment, how are we looking with the younger generation? Because I sometimes look at the younger generation and think, is the Army going to be for you in that challenge? Are you happy where numbers are? And if not, what can we do more to kind of support recruitment with the younger generation?
And could you pass the microphone just the row behind you, please?
Hi there, James Banks from infrastructure consultancy ACOM. Given the last 20, 30 years, we've seen a huge reduction in UK footprint in Germany, and given where we are now, could we, dare I say it, see a U-turn on that policy and see more UK infrastructure in places like Germany, a more permanent rather than EFP presence, perhaps a longer-term presence in those parts of Western Europe?
So the man that builds infrastructure.
We're here to help.
Firstly, on that question, NATO are doing its regional plans, and this is the first time, pretty much in a generation, they're doing detailed regional plans. When I served in North Germany, the plans were so detailed, everyone knew where they went. You could meet a fighter pilot, and he would tell you his targets. And when the balloon went up, we all had forests to go and sit in, and all sorts of things. And those regional plans are coming back. I don't know how detailed they'll be, but they'll be a strong indicator about how the Supreme Allied Commander Europe is going to defend Europe in the face of any Russian aggression, and that will define those sort of questions. But I do think there is a premium in being forward and present in the world, right? There is, if you join the army to sit in Tidworth all your life, then I think that the army's in a wrong place if that's what it thinks, and people are joining for the wrong reason. I want the army to be forward and present. Now, whether that's temporary, as in doing a 4-month tour in, 4-month exercises in Kenya and venture training and being there, as opposed to permanently basing and bringing your families and building schools, it's quite interesting, the cultural change since I've left, we were an army that was abroad, Hong Kong, Belize, Cyprus, Germany. We had garrison towns in Germany, schools, secondary schools, everything. That culture's changed. That does present some challenge. It's also changed because wives or husbands are probably earning often more than their military spouse or their military serving spouse, and it's a different conversation about who's going to give up what job to go and live sometimes in a place they find it hard to work. That is a different effect. So we need to be more ready and more deployable, and we need to be more forward in the world with some intelligent application of where we're going to be to do that. So Germany, there's no longer the Iron Curtain, so is Germany the front line compared to Poland or Estonia or Latvia, Lithuania, or Finland and Sweden when it joins? All those things are issues. And I think the regional plans will play out on that. But some countries like Norway and I suspect Sweden and Finland, I don't know, but you know, their view is they don't really need foreign basing. They like foreign support and exercising, and we do one every year with the Marines up in the north, high north. On training, I think what I've really enjoyed watching is just quite how more professional the armed forces are from my day. I mean, it's scary when you go to Sandhurst. I think I wouldn't get in. I mean, you know, you go there and you see thrusting, you know, highly professional individuals. The training aids are better. The SAWS kit, which is the sort of SAWS or TERS, I don't know how to call it SAWS, which is the sort of laser training equipment to know if you've been shot or not shot on a training exercise, has made them unbelievable with their drills. I think that the training is solid and better than it was and more professional. I think, do people want to join the armed forces? Well, I don't know. I mean, young people surprise you all the time. The amazing thing about the Ukrainian conflict is it has demonstrated that we all thought 17-year-olds were only interested in Snapchat and didn't really bother about those things. But the reality is they care about their values as much as their grandparents. It's their conflict. And also across the political divide, across the left and the right, this is a unified British position. You know, I have the SNP, the Liberal Democrat and the Labour Party entirely supporting our plans and our policy on Ukraine. You know, that I haven't seen that for decades. And, you know, I think, you know, I sometimes get colleagues from other parties urging me to do more in those areas. So I think we won't have a problem, but we must also make sure we speak their language, not my language.
And this was, to take a brief detour, this is something we saw, you were talking about, you know, nationalists in the West previously. You saw quite a lot of this rhetoric in parts of the Trump kind of movement of saying, you know, look at the namby-pamby Western military, look at the rough, tough Russian military. You know,
They're all dead.
Exactly. They're so tough, they don't even give their soldiers the proper kit to keep them
I mean, that goes to defence reform, right? And, you know, I've sat on enough of these panels where someone will put their hand up and say, what we need is more tanks and more ships. And you don't have enough. We had, when I was serving, 35 ships, we only got 15, right? All that. So I have it all the time. But fundamentally, you can play top trumps all you like, right? You can boast, oh, I've got these ships and I've got these. But if the ships are tied up because you haven't equipped them properly, because you can't afford to, because you're focused on a number of platforms, if your tanks are unable to protect themselves with active armour, because you wanted to have 1,000 vehicles rather than 700 and arm those 700 properly, then you end up like the Russian forces on the road to Kyiv, dead. You end up with forces that couldn't speak to each other, couldn't protect themselves against handheld anti-tank. But it's all very well because the Russian generals could boast how many they had on parade grounds. You know, they used to boast. I've got 160-odd BTGs, as they call it. You know, it was all great parade ground stuff. We have to make sure that whatever money we get, we are first and foremost fixing the hollowing out of our armed forces and making sure that the young men and women we send into our battle are in equipment that is properly protected, 360, protected from electronic warfare, and we don't go down the line of just simply wanting a parade ground armed forces where we boast about numbers, but we haven't spent the money on the maintenance, on the spares. You know, I can't tell you how frustrating it is when you say, right, we're going to spend X hundreds of million fixing a ship, and then you discover they haven't got a crew. So, I mean, you joke, but, you know, I was determined to fix the Type 45s, which were fantastic ships, but they had a design problem at the beginning, and so it was often evoked as, you know, these ships that were tied up alongside. So we started to fix it, and we were in the process of getting those rectified, and I will spend money on ships stalls, which are things like rudders and spares that have just not been there. So then I said, right, when we fix all 6, how many crews have we got for them? Well, it's not 6. So we need a properly 360 formed defence. We need to be properly ammoed up. We need to invest in our supply chains. We need to fix dry docks and cranes and things like that, which everyone thinks is dull. No one, you know, when I do my next press release launching a crane or something, no one will turn up and no one will care. I don't care when anyone turns up, but unless you put those maintenance, you spend the money on infrastructure, Mr. Infrastructure, you will, you won't be able to run your submarines and your ships and your tanks, and you'll end up the army I served in. You know, you press the button in 1991, about 30% of our armoured vehicles never left the barracks. We used to go to crash out, and you'd go to the technical quartermaster for your ammunition with a paper chitty and get a paper chitty back pretending you had the ammunition. You know, it's I can't tell you how demoralising it is to serve in a hollowed out armed forces. So before we start, you know, trying to replicate 1980s BAUR and having huge numbers of armoured divisions, we should ask ourselves, how much of a hollow out do we have to fix? And it's significant. And then we can talk about what the new armed forces will look like.
Let's see now. There's the lady at the back, and then the gentleman in the blue tie.
Bell, or Wallace if you prefer. I'm chairman of Kenilworth and Southam. Last year at conference, I attended a security panel which basically talked non-stop about China. They were asked the question by the audience, what about Russia? Are they a threat? And basically the panel laughed and said they're nothing more than a petrol station run by mafia. Would you say the West were caught napping?
My name is Ronnie. I'm a student from London. Thank you both for being here. The ConHome events are always my highlight of conference.
I'll pay you later.
My question is, what was the toughest decision you had to take as Defence Secretary, and is there a decision that you would come to regret?
Well, I think that's... I mean, I know two decisions. I'll give you two. So one was talking to the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, about whether or not we sent 16 Air Assault Brigade into Kabul, to an airport. We didn't know whether it was secure or not. We didn't know what would be waiting for us, and it's one of those decisions that you wouldn't know until the plane landed, and either something happened or it didn't. And that's, you know, that's a responsibility question. You know, you've got somebody's lives that you have to send in and do that. I think the other one was on Russia. You know, there were a lot of people that thought if we gave NLAWs, it would provoke Putin and, you know, all these things, and it wouldn't make a difference. And, you know, I think our decision to stand by the Ukrainians have been proved the right thing to do, both morally, but also we've helped them push back Russia. I mean, you know, and of course it's at a risk, but I took the view that if you don't help Ukraine is fighting for us, let's be honest, and Putin was coming back for more, as we saw, to do that. Look, on was the West caught napping? I'll have to leave other people to decide that. You know, just because you have military superiority doesn't mean to say people aren't threats. You know, just because in theory, in a general war, you might beat them, it doesn't mean to say that they will stop being a threat. They don't get the same memo we do. They don't go, oh, well, I'll give up then, I'll be perfectly nice, because, you know, on paper, the Americans could beat us. But people they aren't rational, they don't function that way. In a sense, I think, as it has been proved, and I think the reason Russia was so important, and still is important, is for all our other adversaries and competitors around the world, Russia is the bad child in the class that shows how far you can push the rules before you get thrown out of the school. And so people go, well, look, they can go quite a long way before anyone actually does anything, which is why Ukraine matters.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more round. We've got the questions. The gentleman here has been very patient, and I also hear the gentleman right at the back.
Petra Revko, I'm the chair of the Association of Ukrainians in Great Britain. Two quick points. Do you think the UK and the West should have done more in 2014, which may have averted what happened on the 24th of February? And it's been reported today that France has been really weak in supporting Ukraine militarily, as little as 2%. Is there any pressure the UK and other Western allies can put on France? Because at the moment, it would seem Ukrainians do have the Ruskies on the back foot, and maybe now is the time to push more military support into Ukraine to drive the Russians even further back.
Thank you. Good morning. Mike Jordan, councillor in God's own county of North Yorkshire. Is it worth...
Talking a Lancastrian. It was one Rose that won the War of the Roses.
It was going so friendly as well.
Help. Is it worth sending our Chancellor to see Putin to explain to him how to do a U-turn?
It's got less friendly.
I wouldn't expect anything less from Yorkshire. Nothing less. Look, I think on the first question, look, to be fair, I'm not really going to comment on the French because I haven't seen that report. Look, the French just put in some Caesar long-range artillery. They've done a few of those. the French have been clear that they're not going to publicise all their help, so I don't know what is in the public domain and what's secret. We've certainly seen President Macron's position hardening over the last few days. I mean, he is well, the last few weeks, he's taken a view, and I never joined the sort of bandwagon that wanted to attack President Macron for trying to speak to Putin, right? Someone has to speak to Putin. Someone has to tell him he's lost. Someone has to tell him to think twice. And you need, when you're dealing with someone like Putin, lines of communication. You absolutely do. And President Macron wanted to maintain that. That is entirely, he has my support for it. Doesn't change anything. It didn't change the facts on the ground. I think what weapon systems we send, how much more can we do, that's never stopping. My Danish counterpart texted me the other day, can we do more? He convened a conference in Copenhagen at the beginning of August where we recognise that our own stocks are only limited, so we have to start buying stocks, and therefore we've set up an international donor fund. I scour the world for Russian Soviet era kit. I've got a pretty good job opportunity, I think, when I finish. I know about arms smuggling by the looks of things. I've met some really interesting people, I have to tell you. And they are straight out of Central Casting, I have to tell you. And we've gone and bought stuff. We bought a whole load of howitzers, self-propelled howitzers from Belgium. Right? There was an arms dealer in Belgium that seems to have a shed full of these things. Genuinely, I don't know why, but he does. And we sent them. They're being used right now in Ukraine. So we keep the flow. Through the International Donor Coordination Cell, which is based in Germany, which is a sort of US, British, actually multinational now. It was originally British with some Americans, and now it's effectively truly multinational. We make sure that we bring in all the requests, make sure they're all in one place, rather than, when it started, everyone wanted to help. So MPs would bring me lists, ambassadors would bring me lists. You'd probably had a list that you lobbied MPs with, and we just wanted it in one place to make sure it's there. So the flow is still going. The international community determination has not wavered. I know the media would like to write, we won't get bored of this. They're not. In fact, it's the other way around. So the key is to make sure we do our very best to give Ukraine what is appropriate and what they need, and to keep a little bit in reserve insofar as that President Putin knows there is an escalation, that if he does these things, and I think there are certain weapon systems that you still have not seen Ukraine get, but we have come a huge way from short-range anti-tank weapons to a position now where we are all providing long-range artillery, those HIMARS, tanks, helicopters, I think even some fighter planes. I mean, remember the row between Poland and, it seems like decades ago. So the question really here is that Putin or Fram.
That example that you mentioned of the Polish proposal for transferring planes, there's a kind of frustrating story here, isn't there, in which there's been a reluctance at times on the part of the United States and at times by others to say, well, even if we leave aside the escalatory question, are the Ukrainians ready to use this system? It'll take them time to learn, so we shouldn't give them and let them start. Has the lesson now been learned that Ukrainians are quick to pick things up? They need them. Yeah. And if you want them to, if you think it'll take a while, do it now.
So that is not the limiting factor anymore. By God, they're determined. I went to see in a secret location early on when I decided we're going to give them high-velocity anti-air missiles. He started with short-range anti-tank, and now we were giving Mach 3 high-velocity missiles at short range. I went to see them being trained. And our Royal Artillery guys were training these people, and they had literally a 4-day training course. And this thing, I don't know, I wasn't a gunner, but I suspect the British course to train people to use anti-air missiles would be months or weeks. It wasn't going to be something you're going to make up. And I met one Ukrainian, and he never missed. He never missed in his whole training. He never missed a single target on every simulator. The artillery staff sergeant said, "I can't believe this guy." He has never. And he's gone on to never miss in real. So I kept tabs on them. When you're fighting for your lives and your country, you're going to learn. Now, there are certain things you can't just shoehorn into a couple of days, and that's just the reality of it. But I think that is not the limiting factor. The limiting factor is still about making sure we calibrate our response and the response to Putin's aggression in a way that President Putin does not have the excuse that this is an attack against Russia, which is obviously what he would like. like to say NATO is attacking Russia. This is not a NATO response. There's a bilateral response. You know, I convened a donor conference on February the 25th. I had 25 countries. That was convened by me, including Ireland, including countries that are historically deeply neutral were happy to recognise what was going on and look at humanitarian aid and other things. Really important changes. It's not a NATO response. We can't say it's NATO trying to invade him. And no one is actually attacking Russia insofar as the Ukrainians are doing what they need to do to defend themselves and their country. And I think that's quite an important line.
And you've diplomatically skirted the hostile question from North Yorkshire, which I'm undiplomatically going to drag you back to.
Well, I've said, I don't think Russia does U-turns.
There we go. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I should flag up, I think I'm right in saying the next event in this room, which you'd be very welcome to, is how can the government turbocharge entrepreneurship across the UK. There's also, that's at 11 o'clock. We also, in the Conservative
Defence spending is one of the ways you can do it.
Well, there we go.
We spend billions of pounds in the UK on innovation, and some of our innovative work, without big, huge state subsidies, just straightforward drones and sensors and people are in Ukraine right now helping. We've sold these products to them or given them to them, and they are making a real difference. So that is pull-through innovation to success story.
Well, you're going to love the other event.
Defence pound matters.
Which is at 11 o'clock in the ConservativeHome marquee. We have Tom Tuggenhat and others on the topic cyber defence, ensuring security and resilience in a turbulent world, in a former brief formally held by you. But it only falls to me, ladies and gentlemen, to say thank you very much to all of you here in the room and for your attendance, your questions. Thank you to everyone watching at home. This will all be on YouTube for people to catch up again on the ConservativeHome YouTube channel and on conservativehome.com. It's been my privilege to host this discussion, and I hope you'll join me in giving a very warm thank you to Ben Wallace.